And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Real Estate Show on KCMX News Media 880. Pete Belcaster and Joe Brett, the real estate guys, with you today. And thanks for joining us here on KCMX. We've got a fellow here in the center with us today. His name is Greg Stabek. He's the Natural Resource Program Manager for the Rogue Valley Council of Governments. Nice to have you here, Greg, and to our show.
Well, it's nice to be here.
Yeah, you've been a natural. What is the natural resource guy? What's your job there? Because I can imagine it's got to be all sorts of things.
Covers a lot of different aspects related to natural resources, clean water, clean air, contaminated properties, basically anything that has to do with natural resources, the environment.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a lot. It's a big thing around these parts. And on the phone today, we got Len Farr, who was a geologist from a company called Stantek, an environmental engineering company out of Portland. Len, are you there with us too?
I am.
Well, it's good to have you guys too here. When we talk about brownfields, it's something that we've done almost 500 shows here and over 10 years, and it's something that we've never really talked about. And so who wants to say a brownfield? When we talk about that, what does that really mean? Len, can you help us with that?
Yeah, you bet. So I can give you the official definition, and that is that brownfields are real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of contamination. That's sort of the official definition, but a more practical definition that I like to use is it's really any piece of real estate that is not developed to its highest and best use. So it might just be a piece of property that doesn't have contamination at all, but that is underdeveloped. That maybe it used to have a building on it, and that building's been demolished, and it's just been sitting idle for a few years.
Yeah, interesting. Well, contamination comes in all sorts of I'll say flavors, doesn't it? I think of just like gas contamination or oil or something like that, a spill, but it really is more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot more. It could be chemical. I mean, we're looking at, potential like former dry cleaners. There's a lot of industrial, some logging operations, if they did any wood treatment. There's machinery, asbestos. So there's just lots of potential properties out there.
Does it surprise you? I'm trying to think of how many potential properties that this might affect as you look at this stuff? Because in our experience, I've only had maybe one or two, Joe, that and both of those were underground tanks, that were there, which no one knew they were there, kind of thing like that. But this goes beyond that.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, I didn't mention like medical facilities, like former hospitals. So there's a lot of examples in the valley and also in the region of where there are these properties, and where in some cases they've already been rehabilitated and redeveloped even in the greater Medford area. Yeah.
And I suppose that when you find, you can't buy a property this way, can you? I mean, I'm trying to think.
I think the regulations and the standards and it's probably much more stringent. We know more and know more ways to protect our potential buyers and to mitigate these potential hazards. But it's an evolving science, probably.
I mean, I think I'll let Len answer that a little.
Yeah, Len, you do this all the time, dealing with these types of properties. So tell us what you see out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's great to be in Oregon, for one thing. I think Oregon has a very progressive regulatory system, so, contamination doesn't have to be a barrier to redeveloping a piece of property. There are very cost-effective ways that you can look at a property, determine whether it's not it's contaminated, and if it is contaminated, there can be very cost-effective ways to deal with that. And, I can point out one very visible site in Medford as well, and that's the Northgate Marketplace site.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was the old Medco plant.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And that's a good example of how even when you have contamination, it doesn't have to be a barrier to redevelopment. What went on out there is there was some contamination identified related to some former wood treating operations.
Sure.
But they were actually able to deal with that contamination just during construction of the Northgate Marketplace. And,
really? So they didn't have to like remove thousands of tons of soil, that kind of thing, at that North Medford site?
No, not at all.
Wow.
There was some soil that had to be hauled off site just as part of the construction project.
Okay.
And because that soil was contaminated, it did have to be properly managed, which meant taking it to a landfill. But a lot of contamination just remained on the site, and it's now under the buildings, it's under the parking lot, where no exposure is going to happen. So
it's
interesting.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I say Oregon is very practical in their approach, and they don't make you clean up something for no good reason. If there's going to be no exposure to the contamination, if there's a building on top of it, for example, you don't have to remove it.
Okay. And I'm interested, Len. I know developers listen to the program. What type of process is in place to where, as they develop their plans and they purchase the site, does that work go on before they actually close the deal, or how do they come to terms to purchase the site, knowing that there's going to be some mitigation and some issues to work out there?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that can happen. When someone acquires a piece of property and they're aware of contamination, they're always careful to try and limit their liability for that cleanup,
right. Sure.
and also to understand going into the deal what the cleanup costs are going to be. So those are the main things that they want to make sure they cover. The DEQ does have a program called the Prospective Purchaser Agreement Program, where you can actually go to the DEQ as a prospective purchaser of contaminated property and negotiate agreement with the DEQ, and that agreement actually will define exactly what cleanup has to be done, so you can assign a cost to that, and it also ensures environmental liability protection for the purchaser. It even protects you against third-party liability. So that's a great tool to limit liability.
That's important for, or otherwise developers would not have the incentive or necessarily the wherewithal to develop these former properties, industrial sites, and that nature.
And speaking of industrial sites, the old Dairygold plant in Medford was one that was, I know people were looking at that, and that was a contaminated site. It had been there for, Greg, you've seen that. You're probably aware of that, isn't that? That's an example of a use that was done something other than what is the new owners would want to make with it, right?
Right. I mean, there's certainly the potential for a lot of contamination there. So that's where this program really can help out, is it could go ahead and, if the site was eligible, pay for some of the, environmental work to try to figure out the extent of the contamination, if there is any, at the very least, really just answer that question so you can go ahead and move forward and know what the cleanup might be if you repurpose that property.
Yeah, it sure makes some sense, though, Len, as you said, that no one's going to judge. There's no incentive to buy a contaminated piece unless you can at least look at it and see how can you mitigate it or what you really have to do with that.
And we need those properties to be refurbished and to be back into business in many ways, for the tax rolls, for the local economy, and just for the room we have. We're running out of room for industrial sites, and we've just added some in the urban growth boundary expansion, but it's precious ground. It really is.
Well, we'll see how this progresses with it. I'm always curious just about where you find the properties. If someone knows they've even got something on properties, and does the COG help with that at all, Greg? Or how do I know?
That's just my due diligence. Yeah.
It's just your due diligence you got to do?
Well, I mean, and I'll have Len expand on this as well, but I mean, there are various sources we look to do what we call an inventory of properties. So there are some databases out there that look at some of the history of the property and actually have, if there have been, registered storage tanks or leaking tanks. So we did create inventories in several areas as part of the work that we did. And then if there is a site of interest, we go ahead and, Len's company does the groundwork for it, but looks at, historical use of the property, Sanborn maps, old historical records, occurs, what's on site now. So it's all part of the process. And then I think everything also goes into the inventory, and then also goes into, further down the process if it looks like there might be something phase one, phase two.
All right, now somebody made a decision, I suppose at the COG level or somewhere, to apply for this EPA grant that you've been awarded of $600,000 to help remediate this issue, correct?
Correct.
So where did that come from, Greg? Did it come from the COG, or why did you even want to apply for it? Was the issue something so big that you had to, or tell us how that came about?
Well, the grant, I want to emphasize, is a coalition grant, so it's a partnership, and it was members of the coalition are the City of Medford, the City of Central Point, Jackson County, but certainly the focus is White City, the industrial area out there,
Sure.
and then the City of Grants Pass, and just the realization that there was a lot of empty, vacant property. There's a lot of potential, like you mentioned. I mean, there's kind of a limit to where some of these, development can go, and then there's also just a lot of repurposing out there, and we were aware of a lot of programs, a lot of good examples where they really, community gardens and affordable housing, businesses. So, I mean, we just saw the opportunity and just felt the time was right, with work that was going on at Northgate a few years ago, the whole Lithia Commons project, that was a brownfield planning grant. So there's a lot of great examples. So again, I was going
to say, I did not know that about Lithia Motors there. It was a brownfield grant.
Right,
because that land out there was used, well, for other purposes. I mean, a lot of other purposes, actually, over the years, wasn't it? It's interesting.
Right next to a heavily industrial little corner there, the Jennings property there.
Well, and look where you're building homes a lot of places and over former orchards or wherever they are, so you can have contamination of different kinds at different levels. Okay, Len, you work with these folks and got the grant, which is really terrific. We got a break coming up here, so just tell us a little bit, this grant, what is it actually meant to do?
Yeah, so the EPA's goal with this program is in large part economic development, and so it's a very popular bipartisan program back in Washington, D.C., because it's not really thought of as an environmental program. And the EPA
scares politicians.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the EPA they track the economic development that comes about as a result of the projects that happen, and that's how they maintain the bipartisan support for the program. Is they've calculated, for example, how many jobs are created by every dollar invested, and how many additional dollars in property taxes are collected as a result of the program.
And has the economy played a role in this? I mean, there's a lot of economic activity right now in Jackson, Josephine counties. Has that played a role in your thinking also, that it's important to have this project now?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, that was part of the timing I was mentioning before. It's just there's a lot of need, there's a lot of potential for the economic development. And again, there's a lot of, I can talk about more of the opportunity later, but the timing was good.
We got to go. Okay, we got a break coming up here, so stand by. We're talking today here on the Real Estate Show with Len Farr, geologist from Stantek Environmental in Portland, and Greg Stabek from the Natural Resources Program Director at the COG. We're coming right back to KCMX right after this. And welcome back to the Real Estate Show here on KCMX News Media 880. Pete Belcaster and Joe Brett, the real estate guys, with you here on September the 18th. Thanks for joining us today. It's been interesting, school's back in, the weather getting cooler. Have you noticed that? It's a little bit of rain on Mount Ashland, wasn't there, this last week?
Feels just right.
Crazy.
They're a little cooler in the morning. We're just right on time.
Of course, don't forget you can check out any of our past shows at realestateshoworegon.com. A lot of great shows there. We'd like you to check them out for sure. Today, we're with Greg Stabek, who's a Natural Resource Program Director from the Rogue Valley Council of Government. And on the phone today is Len Farr, who's a geologist from Stantek Company in Portland. They're an environmental engineering firm. Together, they've gotten a $600,000 EPA grant to remediate contaminated properties, right? Contaminated soils or properties. Is that the simple way to say that? kind of?
Yeah, kind of. Again, it's more, I don't want to, caution people that again, this just really does all the work necessary to take that next step to actually remediate the property. So it's, it's getting the properties in, finding out the extent of the contamination. Again, if there's any, doing some, kind of project planning for, what sites could look like once they might be, redeveloped.
Right.
So, it goes through the whole process, but the funding would be the next stage after this. This is really just step one, just to get the process going.
So how do I get an environmental assessment of my property? Think of different whether it's commercial. Think of it, there's commercial, there's agricultural properties, etc. So step one is an assessment, right?
Correct.
Do you do that, or how am I going to go? How do I go about getting that done?
So again, the project, the grant has funding to do that. So the way the process works, because again, it's a partnership project, a coalition project. A project is submitted by a coalition member. So if the project was in the city of Medford, the city of Medford would submit it, and that would go to that
so it's
committee.
not an individual.
Right,
so it comes
right,
okay.
yeah.
Right, but it could be, but a private landowner, say if they have a parcel in Medford, they would submit it, talk to the city of Medford. Medford would submit it as a project, and then the committee would vote on it, and then it would go to EPA to make sure it met. The pre-work would be done to make sure the eligibility. It's
called the red tape part of the deal.
Well, they're specific. There's some eligibility determination. There's a couple of different pots, and Len can really speak more to that. And then if approved, then Stantek would go ahead and do the assessment work.
Yeah, Len, what is an environmental assessment? What does that actually entail?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do are called Phase 1 environmental site assessments. And that's really just looking at the history of the site. It's a desktop study. You look at various historical records. You look at environmental databases to see if there are any listings that might indicate a potential for contamination. It does include a visit to the site where you can just look around for visible signs of contamination, and that's typically done first. If we know nothing about the site, we typically start out with a Phase 1, and then if we do identify an issue with potential for contamination, then we would try and resolve that issue through the collection of samples of soil or groundwater, and that's what the Phase 2 ESA is.
Do you get many to Phase 2, or are you generally Phase 1 takes care of most of that?
It's a mixed bag.
Okay.
In our EPA grant, we actually budgeted for 20 Phase 1 environmental site assessments and 14
Phase 2s.
Phase 2s.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And occasionally we'll run into a site that maybe there's already been a Phase 1 done, and in that case we can jump right into Phase 2.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about what kind of properties are potentially eligible for these, correct?
Correct.
All right. And they're public or private, correct?
Yeah.
Commercial?
Yeah, basically, any property could be potentially eligible, and we have the grants broken down into two different pools of money. There's $300,000 to deal with hazardous materials, so to cover stuff like the dry cleaners, wood treatment, and then $300,000 to cover petroleum contaminated sites. And there's different requirements, and the petroleum sites are a little bit trickier because there is a question of ownership. I believe it has to be 2 owners removed to be eligible for the EPA funding.
2 owners. So that would eliminate any kind of cannabis operations that have contaminated soils or anything with chemicals, so that wouldn't even work. Kind of thing.
It's only the petroleum has that limitation. The hazardous materials does not.
Does not. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. That's what. So, what kind of? So talk about what the grant pays for. So you said the assessment 1, 2.
Correct. It pays for some. I'm looking at the. Phase 1s, Phase 2, some remedial plans, reuse plans, area-wide plans. So basically, the idea is the Phase 1s we're planning on doing more, leading to some Phase 2, and we're kind of if you look at it, think of an inverted pyramid, kind of goes down and trickles down to the end. So we're anticipating having a couple of high-profile sites that we would be ready for for funding. And then the area-wide planning, we're looking at a few areas for that, and that's really where there's a collection of potential brownfields, kind of an area that people are really interested in looking at how to sort of do more of an area-wide focus, realizing that there'll be multiple properties involved, so kind of get a bigger, I guess, be more efficient with funding, kind of a bigger bang for your buck.
How important that work to get the Northgate site identified, mitigated, and into service. I mean, that was one of the biggest expansions of retail opportunities. Restaurants, the whole 9 yards out there. I'm looking at the South Interchange now and all the new construction out there. Was there anything to deal with? That's the old fairgrounds. That's the old airport.
Did you have a
were there
brownfield
anything out there to deal with in the new development there? Or did that take place before the interchange project
it might have. Yeah, it might. Well, they did work out there.
I know. I'm curious. I'm nosy about that now. I'm just thinking. I see those new projects.
I don't know what they did.
And I don't know offhand if there was any brownfields as part of that work. It wasn't anything included in our project. I'm not sure if Len has any knowledge.
Okay, here's another one that may be eligible for that. I would think is the old Croman Corporation property down in Ashland that's being redeveloped from an old mill site. They've done a lot of work in there, but that's not part of this. Okay.
Right. Well, again, because we knew we would have so much to deal with as is, because you had asked earlier about how many properties there were. I think in our inventories we came up with, just doing areas along kind of the Highway 99 through White City Industrial Area and Grants Pass. I think we came up with several hundred. So we knew that we just really had to limit kind of where our focus was.
Sure.
It doesn't mean we can't look at other areas. Like we've had, we know there's some properties in Talent and Phoenix and Ashland.
I'm sure there are.
And we've had some requests. So we're looking at, and since Jackson County is a coalition member, in theory, anywhere in Jackson County would work. It's just that we definitely need to focus on our the areas that we have in our application, but again we can look at areas outside.
So Len, you have managed these types of projects before, right? Is the way I understand that you've done these before?
Yeah, I've done a dozen or so of these projects.
And what kind of reaction do you get from them? Do you get people coming in and as Greg just said and seeking that, or tell us what kind of response you get when you do these projects?
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been that these projects do take a little bit of time to get off the ground, and that's what we're currently working on in the Rogue Valley is getting the word out about the program, but the momentum kind of builds over the 3-year life of the project.
3 years,
Usually, we have 3 years to spend that $600,000, and I have yet to complete one where we didn't spend all of the money. And I've never had a person that participated in the project express dissatisfaction, or regret.
And where were some of these other projects done around the state at?
Yeah, so I'm currently wrapping up a project in Coos Bay.
Okay.
We're working on one in Klamath Falls.
Okay.
North of you guys, we've got Eugene Springfield. We've got one in Salem, one in Newport. We're only working on one right now east of the Cascades, and that's in Ontario, Oregon.
Yeah. And all these were grants, right? All these were grants supported then, right?
Yep,
wow.
That's right. In fact, Eugene is working on its second grant, so they've received about $1.3 million from the EPA to date.
Well, you got 3 years to take care of this, fellas, and so hopefully you're going to be able to do that. And I would certainly think, just thinking, where properties' potentials are. Now, one of the things was, what are properties that are not eligible for this, okay? Because it's not everybody, not all these properties are eligible, right?
Correct. Right. So there are other opportunities with, there's the Department of Environmental Quality has programs, Business Oregon. So there are other avenues to potentially help, properties that aren't eligible for EPA funding. And actually EPA does have other ways, some technical assistance programs that also can provide help for some properties that aren't eligible under this program.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious as to what kind of response you're going to get out of this when it's done. What do you think? I mean,
it sounds like they've got people lined up, just word of mouth, and people who are in the know or have these issues to deal with are pretty much on their radar? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I would think it's fair to say that there's a lot of properties that are on our radar, and there's a lot of interest in the program. It hasn't currently translated into a lot of on-the-ground applications, but we're starting to get a few in. I think once we get a few successes and people see what can be done with this program, and then also think about, what might be down the line, in terms of what the property could be, I think people get really excited because there's just, there's so many great examples locally across the state of potential for, numerous redevelopments and things that get people really excited. And you may be able to actually pick up some interesting buys on these things, from contaminated properties that are listed that way. You have to reveal all that kind of stuff on them, so you learn those things. Redevelopment, these are all things that are out there. Probably some great sites, that we don't even think about, we don't even know about. Outstanding economic stimulus, too, because we're taking properties that 50 years, 40 years ago, we had different standards for what was acceptable on an industrial property. And we didn't have quite the knowledge of what the leftover consequences would be. Now we're much more savvy about that. So we're cleaning up, refurbishing, and putting back to work and back into the tax rolls and back into the support of the community and the region properties that otherwise could languish or without this stimulus or this help. To get started, who would take it on? No one's going to develop take that. Yeah, sounds like a win-win, really. It doesn't sound like a downside for anybody involved. It's a good role for government there. Len, we'll give you one more question, and then we'll let you go. But are you going to manage or be involved in the program down here in Jackson, Josephine counties like you have in other places then?
Yes, for sure. Okay.
You're pretty excited about that? You think there's some potential here for this, getting rid of the money? Okay, that'll be a good thing if you can do it.
Yep. I look forward to the challenge.
All right. And have you started on it already? Have you guys started on this already?
We have started on it. We're, I think, about 8 months into the project, so there's a lot of, work that needs to be done to get the program going, to set up, guidelines and set up our process for decision making. And as I mentioned, we just got our first property in the hopper to do phase 1 assessment work. So I think once we get that, a few properties done, some successes, we'll get a lot more interest and we'll get a lot more properties. Because again, there's a lot of things that are really close. Well, we'll want you to come back, okay? It's good you're on the radio show. Let's get the word out, and we'll pique people's interest. Well, that's what we're hoping. When Len comes down next time or something, we'll get an update from you guys, okay? And see how you're doing. So we wish you well with that. It's going to be fascinating to see how it goes, and it's going to open up a whole new avenue of properties again for development, for economic development, creates jobs. Okay, we got a break coming up here. We're going to be right back here to KCMX right after this. And welcome back to the Real Estate Show here on KCMX News Media 880. Pete Belcaster and Joe Brett, the Real Estate Guys, with you. Don't forget, you can check out any of our past shows at realestateshoworegon.com. Or if you need any real estate advice, we're also here to help you with that. You can email us at Pete or Joe at realestateshoworegon.com. The real estate market, hope we have some comments at the end. The stats came out, the latest stats came out, Joe, and one of the things you were really seeing in the market is a change. The 500,000 priced and above is now almost in a normal 6 month and above market. So things have changed there. Things below have been moving there. Below it is still there. The demand is still there. Inventory's up. Anyway, it's a changing market, as you know, so buyers and sellers all have to be aware. It's not like it was 2 months ago or a month ago or 3 months ago. Nor is it ever that way. You don't want it to be that way anyway. Today here on the Real Estate Show, we've been talking with Greg Stabek from the Natural Resource Program Manager at the Rogue Valley Council of Government. Len Farr, we just let him go on the phone. You're working with somebody who's pretty experienced with this, so you're kind of lucky about that, aren't you? Absolutely. And I mean, certainly, there were several consultants that put in bids for helping us out, and certainly Stantek's experience came through, and that's why we ended up working with them. And certainly there are technical advisors and be doing most of the technical work, the assessment work, and everything like that on the program. Now, since you're here, so we got Greg here, and he's like the Natural Resource Program Manager of the COG, which is the Council of Governments supporting both counties here. You're involved in other programs too, right? Clean water, Clean
Clean
water,
air.
clean
Clean air we could use.
right.
You deal with all of these, right?
You haven't done very well on the clean air lately.
Clean air is a tough one. But yeah, so we the role of the Council of Governments is really to provide support to our members, which are primarily cities and counties, and also kind of be regional collaborators and regional facilitators of programs. So we have a couple of big Clean Water Act programs, where as part of that we work with the local communities and then also a ton of partners. We have a water quality monitoring program. We do stream restoration work.
So you work with the Jackson Soil Water Conservation District in some of the stream management programs and those kind of things that we've talked about over the years.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And then another thing that a big program, and the timing is good now because it's is education. We do a lot of the Clean Water Act. Certainly part of that emphasis is community outreach, public outreach to schools. So this month tends to be September and October tend to be huge. There's a Stream Smart program which we're a part of. It's a regional education platform. It's a website and it has a number of different programs. So certainly encourage people to check that out. And under that we did the Adopt a River program. So Adopt a River. So we adopted Bear Creek as our focus area for this year. For 2000, if it's for the next 2 years, and as part of that, we have the annual Bear Creek cleanups, and those are coming up on September 29th. So there's 8 starting locations along Bear Creek. So certainly invite people to, if they're interested, to volunteer and sign up for cleanups. There's the Bear Creek Fall Festival, which is an education event also on the 29th. And then one of the programs that we're heavily involved in that I'm most proud of is the Salmon Watch program.
Yeah.
Oh, the salmon. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's where we were able to provide field days and instruction for students, over 1,000 students last year. And there were, and it's not just us. There are about 20 partners involved. So it's been a great program. About 5 years ago, we brought it back. It was initially an Oregon Trout program, then a freshwater trust that was funded, and then defunded. So we brought it back with the help of a number of partners: watershed councils, cities, soil and water.
It's so amazing when you think of how we grew up and what environmental things were back when we were kids. Versus today, the awareness and how much it's changed, so much for the better. And we can't. I think what we've learned, you can live in harmony. Yeah. Just by some effort and make it better.
And for our young people growing up now, those field trips out to see where farm animals live and where fish come from. I mean, they have a concept that you just go to the grocery store and that's where everything is at, and it just happens to magically show up on the shelves there. But those are becoming more and more important with the educators that we know so well in the Valley, insofar as just getting kids out to really not seeing in a book or on a computer screen, but to be out and be amongst these beautiful natural resources that we have, and the educational experiences that can come with the visit that coincides when
I always tell Joe, people need to know how their food is how they get their
really
food.
Helps.
I mean, it really would make a difference out of the whole thing. Now, you got a date coming up. Let's go back to the environmental part of this, the grant that we were talking about today. You've got some meetings coming up, so if people are interested in this, tell us what's going on with that.
Yeah, correct. We have 2 community workshops for the public for the Brownfields program, and they're going to be on Wednesday, September 19th. And because we have Grants Pass and Medford area, we're going to have a meeting in Grants Pass from 11 to 1. And that's going to be at the council chambers in Grants Pass. Okay. And then the Medford program is going to be 4 to 6 p.m. in the large room at the Medford Library. So we're going to have, actually Len will be down to talk about the program. Okay. We'll have coalition members. So it's just
what day is that again? I think I get that down.
September 19th, next Wednesday.
Oh, September next Wednesday, 4 to 6 p.m. Okay.
Yeah, so we invite everybody's invited. Come ask questions, learn about the program. We can talk more about specifically how it works. If somebody has a property they're interested in potentially bringing forward and wants to learn more, this would be a great forum for them to come and ask about that.
We should. You're at the Grants Pass Council Chambers. We should live stream. We should televise and live stream that meeting and archive it. So that people who can't make it can go back and get the information. I'll talk to you about that.
No, it really would be
that
good.
Sets up perfect because the whole room is set up to do that already. Yeah.
Well, there's thousands of properties. When you think about how many commercial properties, just commercial properties, there are in these 2 counties along these roads, and the uses of them for over 100 years for many of them. We've just built over it, torn something down, put something new on. This is a program, obviously, that I think just going to be a great success.
The historical database
it's a wonderful thing.
It's being developed. Yeah.
So yeah, we wish you well there, okay? And hopefully you'll come back and be success with it and make some good out of it.
Okay,
all right?
well, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate that as well. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes here to go before we get out of here. To remind you again, next week here on the Real Estate Show, we've got it's mortgage interest rate time. Guy Giles will be back. With inched up a little bit, by goodness, over this last week or so, so we don't want those to go too high, those interest rates, because when interest rates go up every quarter point, affordability goes down, and you lose that potential part of buyers under there. Right. So, and that's to me still the biggest concern, Joe, as we go into the fall, and this is a slower time of the year right now. But the affordability for most people has really dropped in both counties over the last year. But the good part about it is that the rise in prices has really slowed down now to that 3% range, which is a healthy range. Wow. We don't want to go to those double digits as we were, and this is so that's a good. So the market is changing. Just want people to know that it's not the way it was, and it's going to be alternating as we go into the fall and winter.
And even through my own experience as a homeowner, through it all, real estate is a really solid investment that is one of the most assured ways to create wealth in your own life, in your personal life.
And there were 14% increase in listings from a year ago during the month of August. So when you add all of that up, we're over 1,000, and for years, remember, we didn't even have 1,000 listings in Jackson County. So that has increased up, but also as a result of that, there's just not as many buyers as there were. Thus, you've got more give and take.
That's different.
More available inventory. What it comes down to is that in certain price ranges, you got more negotiating is going to take place. So the seller doesn't have an advantage, or the buyer doesn't have an advantage when you're there.
Seller's been riding pretty high, smooth wave for a while now. Got to give some back.
Sellers have been on a
their time.
They may be lessening up. Anyway, next week here on the show, don't forget, we'll be back with you as well. That'll do it for the Real Estate Show here for KCMX on the 15th. You have a great week, everybody. For Joe Brett, I'm Pete Belcastro. God bless you all. We'll see you next Saturday right back here on KCMX.